In this episode, we're answering some of our listener questions. We'll be
covering what's happening in the lifestyle areas that boomed as a result of COVID. Why are there so many for sale signs? How can government policy reconcile the interests of investors with the need to foster vibrant, stable communities? How does land tax differ from state to state, and how should this be factored into investment decisions? Should we purchase an A-grade property in a B-grade suburb or a B-grade property in an A-grade suburb for our next principal place of residence? Should we sell an investment property in order to buy a better home to live in? Plus, we have a fact check and a listener dumbo to round out this episode.
Welcome to The Elephant in the Room. This is the podcast where we love to talk about the big things in property that never usually get talked about. I'm Veronica Morgan, real estate agent, buyer's agent and buyer's agent mentor, co-host of Foxtel's Location Australia, author of Auction Ready and co-host of Your First Home Buyer Guide.
And I'm Chris Bates, mortgage broker, recently ranked number 5 in Australia out of over 18,000 brokers in the annual MPA Top 100 Mortgage Broker Awards. Before we get started, I need to let you know that nothing we say here can be taken as personal advice. We always recommend you engage the services of an appropriate and experienced professional.
All right, our first question is from David. I would be really interested if you could explore what is happening in the traditional holiday destination market. These are areas 2 hours from a capital city. I've noticed the Mornington Peninsula has an extraordinary number of properties for sale. Some of these properties have been held for generations. Is land tax driving change? Is it penalty land tax if you don't use the property more than 4 weeks a year? Is it that people escaped to these areas during COVID and now that increase in interest rates has made it too expensive to hold a second property, or they just want to be closer to the CBD? Or is the infrastructure in these coastal areas not supporting permanent living? Will it be an option to hold on to your city property until interest rates drop and prices increase considerably, then buy a heavily discounted property in a coastal destination that normally would be tightly held for generations? What is the social impact of families selling generational property? And like so many of our questions, it's got loads in it. We won't take too long to answer it. We want to hit a few key things or key points on the head. Initial thoughts there, Chris?
Look, it's a really good question. I do think the Mornington Peninsula, though, is a whole case of its own, right? I think if you look 2 hours north of Sydney in particular, and also Brisbane, I don't think you've got the same dynamics playing out that you have down in Mornington. I would say that those markets are still quite strong. Newcastle's doing quite well, Central Coast, north of Wollongong, etc. And the same would be happening in the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast. So that's not a coast. It's not a city problem. It's more of a Victorian problem. And Mornington Peninsula in particular, I think a lot of it's to do, like you said, around the the Victorian government and its changes to land tax. And also just the people who own those properties there. You know, the return to work, Melbourne getting its mojo back. There was significant growth in values down there over the last few years. It was probably one of the hottest markets in the country in COVID, right? The return to work with Melbourne, the attack on second homes. And that's, I think, the key thing here is even if it's not an investment property and you just use it for yourself, your land tax is astronomical compared to what it was. And the thing I think what's happening down there is a lot of people are saying, well, am I using it that much? Maybe I should just get rid of it. There's also the changes with Airbnb down there as well, and caps on nights, etc., and a levy on Airbnb income. So I just think people probably had enough of paying these costs to support these properties. Should I just get out? But also I think there's an over-leverage problem. While you said some of these properties have been owned for generations, I reckon some of those sellers have bought in the last 3 years and they've decided to go back to the city. And I can think of lots of clients who bought down there. So I think that's the issue down there. It's really killed the second home market. And the final point I would say is that sometimes the people with those properties have also got a big owner-occupied debt. And what are you going to get rid of? Your house down in Mornington Peninsula or your house in Brighton where your kids go to school? And so I reckon a lot of people are just offloading their second properties and they're just trying to pay down their owner-occupied debt, take their money and run. But it's a very interesting market. Now, can you be the ultimate timer of the market, selling the capital city and then buy down there? Well, to be honest, you probably Melbourne's been a different market altogether as well, actually, compared to other cities in terms of its growth, and just hasn't performed very well over the last few years. It just hasn't got a supply problem like, say, Sydney and Brisbane has, and Perth and Adelaide right now. But, so the growth in the housing market's really patchy. But I mean, I would say that the growth there is stronger than in Mornington Peninsula. So if you wait for more growth in the housing market in the city, yeah, you might get that first, and maybe you could, then quickly get out and get into Mornington Peninsula. But I think it's a bit of a dangerous strategy. If I was honest, I'd probably try to buy Mornington Peninsula in the current market and buy really well, and buy a really good asset that's got under not much competition, then try to wait for a little bit in the future where you might get more for your house, but you might lose that opportunity to transact and buy a good asset at a good price. And then you might just go from one frying pan to another. And so, this window of opportunity to buy a good asset under not competitive terms, that's not really going to stay around forever down there, because I do think more and more people will make that their forever homes down there rather than their second homes. That would be my take.
I think we did actually discuss these particular locations actually with Jared McCabe back at episode 330 as well. So if you didn't listen to that one already, you might want to go back and listen to that. I think more generally, holiday areas do need to be able to support owner-occupiers in order to be a viable place for working people to live there rather than just retirees. And certainly, as Chris has said, the land tax changes in Victoria are about repaying. Well, they're definitely impacting on behaviour. They're about repaying state debt, but there's some philosophical things that they wanted to get through, if you like, in terms of the way in which people utilise properties. So that is definitely translating into behaviour. And I'd also say, interestingly, the social impact of selling generational property. Well, a lot of generational properties were sold to the people that bought in the COVID boom. So that, in a way, that's sort of taken care of itself. That's not necessarily this issue. I think too, I would say that just don't try to ride the property wave. There's an assumption here that interest rates dropping will result in capital city price rises. However, not necessarily the case, because prices are rising, maybe not so in Melbourne, despite these interest rate rises. And what this shows is that there are many more factors that impact the property market other than just interest rates. So I think trying to ride the property wave is a dangerous sport. It's very risky, and even the experts don't get it right all the time. So hopefully these comments will help you answer that question. But what I do love is a lot of these questions actually pose the answers in them anyway, because our listeners really are thinkers. We have our next question from Nina. Listening to the discussion on negative gearing, I can appreciate the rationale behind investors seeking to grow their wealth. However, it seems that this pursuit has inadvertently contributed to creating a generation of renters who lack a sense of community and ownership. Traditionally, gentrification is driven by excited homeowners who invested in their neighbourhood's well-being, and now with an increasing number of properties owned by investors, the vibrancy and character of areas are at risk. These rent investors often have good intentions and are forced to invest rather than own, but they're relying on their tenants to add value to the street or unit block. These same tenants feel like they can't paint a wall or improve their rental without facing a rental increase. While I understand the potential pitfalls of grandfathering the capital gains tax discount, perhaps a one-time discount as suggested by me could strike a fair balance. Maybe there should be an automatic CGT applied to inherited properties instead of the 2-year grace period. This could stop older people hoarding large family-sized properties with the justification of passing down wealth. This approach might incentivise property sales without flooding the market all at once. Ultimately, how can government policy reconcile the interests of investors with the need to foster vibrant, stable communities? And before we answer that, just a slight backstory there. She's basically saying that she's recently entered the property market with her husband in their mid-30s, and it was frustrating, I should say, to see how difficult it was to secure a family home for a young family who had to relocate a long way away from existing networks just to afford their first home, despite getting an inheritance and also financial gifts from both sides of the family. So, and now they're looking at their friends who are renting, who are subject to rental increases, and really finding that they're under pressure, having to move and relocate their families as well. So there's that rental instability that she's observing amongst her friends, but also her own challenges in affording a first home, even with help. So thoughts on that? It's quite complicated, but I say that because often the way in which we view the world, the way in which we view the property market comes from our own perspective on what we're experiencing in our individual circumstances.
Okay, there's a lot there, Nina. I appreciate the question, and absolutely, we talk to clients all the time, so we understand all the struggles that first-time buyers and renters are going through and the difficulties entering the market. So I get all that. I guess, at a top level, though, is that, investors aren't the big bad wolf here, right? Ultimately, We need investors in the market, whether that's mums and dads or single investors or corporations or build to rent. We need to, or it could be the government, right? And we need people to provide rental housing. And the government's basically said, we don't want to do this for decades. We're going to get the Australian society to do it. And what we need to do is incentivize them to do it. And so investors have actually are a participant in the market, but they're not the one that drives prices the most. It is obviously owner-occupiers. And sometimes investors do have things really in their favour. I can think back to the 2015 boom, and investors had a free-for-all. They could borrow way more than owner-occupiers. You'd get ridiculous interest-only terms. You could leverage up. And that was way too heavily weighted to the people who had borrowing capacity and equity to kind of leverage up. That world doesn't exist today, right? It's really hard to leverage up consistently and buy big portfolios, right? So I think that's a good thing because you could absolutely, take an arbitrage and take advantage of the market a few years ago. Look, I do think that some suburbs will have an oversupply of investors. So when you look at the ownership rates, you'll see that, 60, 70, 80% of the suburbs renters and 20% are owner-occupiers. And so I do think that that's not great for the vibrancy of the suburb per se, because you're right, you're not getting that community because it's a little bit more transient. But I don't think that's many suburbs. Most suburbs are, getting to a 50% owner-occupier rate. Some are getting to 70, 80%. And so I would say that, and I do think renters do provide a different demographic to what sometimes the people who are owning are, right? It might be skewed towards more older people, and renters may be more towards younger people. And so I think you need a good mix. I think the best suburbs do have a good mix between renters and owners. And I don't think too many suburbs are, even the high-rise heavens or hells, what you want to call them, right? The little high-density pockets, right? Even them are moving more and more to owner-occupiers because less investors are buying in there, and a lot of first-home buyers are buying in these suburbs off the investors, right? So that would be my take. Look, I think if you really disincentivize investors to enter the market, then you've got to have a solution for providing rental accommodation. Because as you can see over the last 2 or 3 years, as investors have left, what has happened to rents? Okay, so that's not because of higher interest rates. It is inadvertently because higher interest rates has forced investors to sell. And more investors are selling than more investors are entering, and they're happening in different areas. So you're getting an undersupply of rental accommodation and you're seeing rents go through the roof. And so the solution, getting rid of investors, has actually caused a huge increase in rentals prices. And so you can't have your cake and eat it would be my thoughts here. Ultimately, I think longer term a change to CGT is wise. I do think it's unfair that you don't pay any CGT on any growth. You can reuse that growth to buy other assets. You could buy shares. So you never pay growth till you sell it, which I think is the right thing. But then to get that and then also only have to pay 25% tax on it versus 50% tax on your income, I think that's a bit generous. And so, but I do think, negative gearing has a place. I think if you want to encourage someone to invest, then the cost of investing should be able to be offset by the cost of the income you receive. I just think that makes sense. It's just when people can take advantage of that to the nth degree, like in 2014, that's when people can really, build multi-million dollars portfolios on small incomes and get huge tax offsets. But that just doesn't exist anymore. You can borrow 4.5 times your income right now. Good luck trying to negative gear into a big portfolio. It just won't. It's just not possible.
Interestingly enough, I was on with Martin North the other night, and he showed a chart that showed the proportion of borrowing that goes to owner-occupiers, that goes to investors, and goes to first home buyers. And the investor proportion is on a steep rise, actually, and it's really looks to be mirroring that rise prior to all those changes in 2016. So anyway, watch this space. I would hazard that there are different people investing in property now than there were back then, a different, potentially different income bracket. I would say the makeup of investors is very different. But into what Chris is talking about, areas where you've got a very high proportion of investor stock rather than owner-occupier stock, that often happens, say, in a new building or a new house and land area, if there's been heavy marketing to investors, you will see that from the outset, you've got sort of high proportion of investors and renters versus owner-occupiers. And that can have an impact of, I guess, that area as it establishes, or the building as it establishes its community, it doesn't have that same sort of, I guess, foundation of the owner-occupiers who really are there for the longer term. But I'm not sure I agree about renters taking away the vibrancy and character of an area. In all cases, for example, in established areas such as Potts Point in Sydney, well over 60% of the properties are occupied by tenants, and yet it's one of the most vibrant areas around. So it's just not an automatic assumption. It also sounds a little bit like Nina is suggesting that if an area were to transfer to investors in preference to gentrification, then that would stymie the character of the location. So I'd be keen to understand whether she had any particular suburbs in mind when she was suggesting that. It is true, though, that short-term leases are a disincentive for tenants to make improvements, and they are also fearful of triggering a rental increase, both by making improvements but also by requesting maintenance, requesting repairs, which is a sorry state, but that's the way it is with some people. And I think that it's interesting, if you want to know more about this, is to listen to our interview with Cameron Murray, which is episode 333, around the question around whether governments are able to or can do anything in terms of their policy settings to sort this out, because he points out very well that governments are unlikely to do anything politically unpalatable like an inheritance tax. So yes, there's rhetoric around affordability and all the rest of it, but are they really going to do something that's going to get them voted out of office? They may be able to do something to get changes to CGT, perhaps if they can find a Trojan horse, But I think any increase in tax, the tax that people need to pay on the sale of a property will actually act as an incentive to hold property, not to sell it. So I think it's a shit sandwich at the moment for young families who rent, and we totally accept that. And it's not great, but I'm not sure signing up to the YIMBY movement, because I actually didn't read her bit about the end. She said that all the friends are signing up to the YIMBY movement to feel a little bit more empowered. And I'm not sure that's really going to solve the problem, because the thing is that, anybody who's struggling to get into the property market at the moment or deal with it, you have to fight the battles that are within your control. And that is, what can you afford and where? And I think a big problem is we rant and rail against the system. The system is the system, and it may be crap. I'm not saying it's a good system, but it is the way it is. And ranting and railing against it isn't actually going to get you a roof over your head. You have to work out how to work within that system to get where you want to be. And it's one of the things that we teach in your first home buyer guide, is really just a process of going about how to work out where you should be looking to buy, how to go about the process of working with a broker to find out what your budget is, et cetera, and really just slow it down and think, what can I do with my circumstances? And I have to then go and do that, rather than trying to fight a system that is just too big for any of us to control. All right, from Linda. Now, this is not so much a question, but a fact check, right? In your episode with Peter Tulip, May 2024, you say Edgecliff has had heritage placed on buildings to prevent development. Did you realise Wallara Council, along with the Heritage Review, also passed an Edgecliff strategy designating many areas for significant uplift beyond the Minns government Todd reforms, up to 26 stories on one site, with an estimated net dwelling increase to house 1,200 people. Plus, proper fact-checking should be made before sweeping remarks are made that aren't based on fact. Heritage status is also determined by state government, true, not local government legislation, and heritage cannot be merely placed on dwellings without a rigorous fact-checking and criteria line that has been set by the state government. Now, I want to just kick in before we hand over to Chris here. Thank you so much for sending this comment, Linda. A couple of things. Our guests will say things that we haven't heard in advance, and we presume that they've done their research, right? That said, we also record a few weeks before we release episode, and here's the timeline for this one. We interviewed Peter on April the 11th. On April the 29th, that's 18 days later, Council resolved to adopt the Edgecliff Commercial Centre Planning and Urban Design Strategy. And on May 6th, we released the episode. So we've included the links in the show notes for anyone who wants to find out what's been adopted by this council. And also a reminder, just because zoning changes and an urban plan allows for higher density, it doesn't automatically translate to commencements. Developers need to decide whether it's feasible. So it's great that the council has adopted this plan in this. It's actually quite a small part of the area anyway. And thank you for bringing that to our attention. We are never scared to be challenged and asked to fact check. And just thought we'd bring that to you. What are your thoughts there, Chris?
Well, I absolutely didn't know about this. And if you look back 3 years ago, I did some research on it. And I do vaguely remember that there was going to be some changes up at Edgecliff station, that they were doing around some work around like this. But this was like back in 2021, and I hadn't heard anything about it. And then I probably, when Pierre said that, I remember it. And I remember just that week reading an article about some heritage slapping on some properties. And so, but absolutely, when this came out, I actually didn't know about this even because it got renounced back in April. It's actually really big news, and it's really big news for that part of the suburb and for down into Double Bay. What does that mean for Elizabeth Bay? How does that affect Paddington and Wallara and, properties within there? And so absolutely, it's quite a big plan. And I haven't heard too much about this in the news and the media as well. And so I do appreciate you highlighting this, because I absolutely love this stuff. And I track, I follow some sites that track all developments and things like that. And I haven't even seen it on there on Urban Developer or other sites. And so thanks for sending it in. We consciously didn't obviously make that mistake. But if everyone is looking to buy in that area, it's similar to sort of a plan, looking at it now, down around Anzac Parade, going down into Kensington, and what they're looking to do along the light rail there. Like, a lot of people just don't know about that. And, they're buying apartments along that, in those pockets, and have no idea that they're trying to turn it into lots of high rises over the next 10 years. And that's where a lot of the housing targets are going to hopefully be met by. So, and if you buy those areas without knowing about these things, it's not to say it could be catastrophic, but you just need to know some parts are going to be affected more than others. And thanks for bringing it to our attention. Anything like this, I absolutely love. So anyone listening who gets anything in this development space they think is a bit interesting, send it through, because I really love reading about it.
And funnily enough, one of my team, Simone, who does our due diligence for clients when we're looking at property, I mean, that's where I went to get the info. Simone, what's happened there? She was like bang on it, straight to me. So, and it is really important that you do check these sorts of things, and that's part of our process when we're looking at properties as well, is to look at not only what has been approved in the immediate vicinity, but also what could potentially be approved, and that's, so we look at the possibility of, when you're doing DA checks, when you're checking for the neighbouring properties as part of your due diligence, which you should do, you are looking at what's already in the wings, whereas this is now, it's a policy, right? And now developers can submit applications with that policy in mind, and that doesn't mean that stuff's all going to get built either, because the developer has to make it feasible. So it's interesting stuff. But yeah, thank you again for that, Linda. Now, next question is from Stuart. In addition to our home, we currently have 3 A-grade investment properties in Melbourne. We have 2 one-bedroom flats in South Yarra, another in Hawthorn. We have a 3-bedroom townhouse in Murrumbina in our SMSF. Basically, this is a question about land tax. He's saying that land tax bill in 2023 was $882.50 for one of the one-bedroom flats. In 2024, it went up to $2,365. So big increase. The 3-bedroom house, they just bought at the end of last year, and the bill for 2024 was nearly $3,500. So the question is, how does this land tax compare to other states? And due to the cumulative nature of Victorian land tax, am I now better to look at investing in other states? Chris?
Stuart, I hope you're up for it, and hopefully this gives people a flavour of the way that we like to deliver advice. And so before we get talking about land tax, I just want to really challenge you on your thinking around A-grade investment properties in Melbourne, right? So South Yarra is not really an area of Melbourne where there's an undersupply or a really strict planning controls to stop more apartments being built. And so you would have to look at the performance of those 2 apartments, and you have to look at how they've performed since you've held them, and you'd have to admit that the growth on those has been really poor. Hawthorn's a little bit different, but a 1-bedroom flat in Hawthorn is not hitting the couple market, it's not hitting the family market. It is getting land value increases much more probably than South Yarra. But also, don't think that's performing as well as a 2-bedroom apartment in Hawthorn. And so I do think, your idea that you've got 3-grade assets in Melbourne, I don't think you do. And I think you would have to look at the performance of those, and you probably realise that they haven't performed anywhere near, say, like the housing market. Same thing, I guess, would go down to your 3-bedroom townhouse in Murrumbeena. I'm always nervous when I see townhouses. And, if you bought that new, because you might have thought you're going to get some depreciation benefits, etc., and you've also punted your superannuation on it, why didn't you potentially just buy a house there? Because you've got a house for the same price as the new townhouse. If it was a new townhouse, the reason I assume it's new is I could be wrong, is because there's not really that many townhouses in Melbourne. A lot of people call them villas down there, etc. And so if there are people who use the word townhouse, usually they're talking about something new or recently built. And I would say, well, I'd probably go for the land option versus the townhouse option down there. You're just going to see the growth much more to the affluent, aspirational part of the market rather than the affordability part of the market and something that's going to age. And so I know that's not why you sent your question in, but before worrying about land tax, I'd be worried about your growth, firstly. Now, Victoria absolutely have gone hard on investment properties down there. I think they've gone way too hard. And they are absolutely taxing property values basically from zero now, land values, rather than having a threshold like other states do. Like in Queensland, it's like 600 and, similar in New South Wales. New South Wales made a change recently. They just said, look, we're not going to increase the threshold. We're just going to keep the threshold as is. So every year, more and more people will get caught up with it. But they didn't just reduce the threshold like they did in Victoria. Obviously, you're benefiting from your 1-bedroom flats, right? There's not much land in those things, but that's also counterintuitive. You haven't got much land. What's going up in value, right? Is it the building? Is there a scarcity to the type of thing that you built on there? Well, probably not in those type of properties. And so that would be the thing that I would go to here, Stuart. I'd challenge you on the quality of your investments first, and then I would worry about the taxes second.
It's a very good point, and it's a great illustration of how we do focus on the wrong things. It's like people are focusing on the rental yield instead of actually whether you've got a good asset that will really do its job for you in terms of setting you up for financial security in the future. I will just point out, as Chris said, yes, every state has different thresholds and land taxes, and they are cumulative, which means that, once you got one investment property that tips you over that threshold, then all the others are 100% subject to land tax. And it is often advised to spread your holdings across states in order to keep under these thresholds. But I guess, and in terms of comparing this scenario to what the situation would be if you held these properties in other states, you can't actually do that because we don't know the unimproved land value of each property. So land tax is based on the land itself before you put building on it and before you develop that property. So, and we don't know what that component is. You can tell me what the property is worth. I still won't know what the component is of the land itself that is used for taxing. I think too that thinking about it, we talk about asset quality, and you really want to own good A-grade assets in your portfolio. If it turned out that you had B or C grade assets, you need to think about, well, should I be selling them or not? If you got C grade, I always say just try to get C grade out of your portfolio. Like long term, they're just hurting you. B grade, a lot of that depends on when or where you are in your life cycle. Like if you're sort of within, 10, 15 years of retirement, for example, the transaction costs of getting out of a B grade into an A grade and the risks associated with that, and also the fact you've got a shorter runway, it's sort of hard, it's hard to justify that. So you look at other considerations before deciding whether you're going to do that or not. If you've got an A-grade asset, absolutely you want to do everything you can do to hold on to that, regardless of whether you're paying land tax for it. That you want to keep A-grade assets. But you do have to be more critical, I guess, in how you assess those assets. I think, too, that selling down and repurchasing does incur substantial costs. And you also have to be confident that you're buying into another state that won't change the rules, right? Victoria's changed the rules, caught people up. You already owned there. You bought under one set of rules, they change the rules, and you're stuck, you're lumbered with the next set of rules, right? So the property still has to make sense to you in the long term based on these new rules, right? Queensland tried to change land tax, and they tried to actually add in your holdings in other states in their calculation as well. So now that failed, but it just demonstrates, I guess, that we buy property assuming that the situation, the rules that are in place are going to stay that way, but they may not. So if you go running around trying to change everything because the rules are change in the state that you're in, well, there's no guarantee they won't change anywhere else either. So I just think you've got to look at what you've got and make decisions based on the asset rather than those rules. And also, if you know, you said they're A-grade assets, okay? Chris has challenged you to interrogate that belief. If you maintain that belief afterwards, then you try to hold them for as long as possible. If you revise your thoughts on that and decide that, actually, they're not as good as I thought they were, then you might look at selling, but for different reasons, not because of land tax.
I'm on a personal mission to help more people make better property decisions. And you can find out all about what I'm working on at veronicamorgan.com.au. And there you'll find resources for first home buyers, details about my buyer's agent mentoring program, access to suburb help for investors, or if you're looking to buy your dream home or an investment property in Sydney's inner west, eastern suburbs or lower North Shore, you can connect with my team at Good Deeds Property Buyers.
If you're thinking about buying your first home, upgrading to a new one, or purchasing an investment property anywhere in Australia, we would love to carefully guide you through this journey and importantly get the finance right. Please reach out via our website, wealthful.com.au.
All right, we've got our final question before we give you our listener dumbo, which I think is a classic. This one's from Andy. He says it's a bit of a long one, and really anyone with a really long, involved question you would actually like some personal advice on, you can reach out to us because you could book in a strategy session. I'm sure Chris runs them. I run them if you want your situation unpicked, right? So we thought we'd run through some key considerations in respect to this particular scenario. So this is from Andy. My partner and myself are both in our 30s with 2 small kids. We live in Sydney's inner west. That's my hometown. We bought our principal place of residence in December 2019. And whilst we benefited from the COVID boom, in hindsight, the property is not the most desirable for the area. It's a 1970s red brick concrete build. And if you know the inner west, you'll know there's a lot of period homes, like either Victorian terraces or Edwardian cottages. Now, he says he's believed this has contributed to us underperforming some comparables, so period homes, that we chose not to purchase or were underbidders on in their search time. So they've pulled out and not bought some properties that are more desirable in the area in which he's bought, and they actually bought something that's not highly desirable in the suburb in which he bought. And now in retrospect, he's looking back and saying those properties have done better in terms of capital growth than his has. So now he's sort of realising that. And then he said, and I question his phrasing here, because he said he lucked out, I don't know what he means by this, by purchasing an investment property in November 2020 for $2.1 million. I don't know how you luck out if you got $2.1 million to spend. We recently had agents asking to facilitate an off-market deal at the 3 to just over $3 million mark. Okay, so he's got the rent on that property that he paid $2.1 million for, and now it's supposedly worth around $3 million, is $1,250 a week. And with current rates, it's heavily negative geared. I can appreciate that. We've cut back our working hours because ideally he wants to keep 4 days a week till the kids are older, both in school. Financially doing the sums is, everything's a bit of a squeeze given interest rates. To complicate things, they took out a loan against their principal place of equity, he says in his words, stupidly on P&I, and bought some shares, right? His questions. Should we purchase an A-grade property in a B-grade suburb or a B-grade property in A-grade suburb for our next principal place of residence? Likely planning to sell our home regardless and repurchase because his wife's not keen on rent vesting, but he wants to defer the purchase of principal place of residence. So he wants to rent for a little while in a new school catchment zone, take advantage of the 6-year rule, and then within that 6 years sell his principal place of residence and upgrade, right? He was originally thinking the North Shore, but he realised that for the budget that he would have to make compromises, like it wouldn't be very renovated, wouldn't be great, really wouldn't have great access to transport. Or he could look somewhere like Beecroft, which is actually a lovely suburb, but he's seeing that as B grade, right? So he's really wanting to know whether it's more financially prudent to go that A grade location in his terms, he calls it A grade, or go somewhere else and buy a better house. So that's the first question. What are your thoughts on that, Chris?
So really, this is like a typical property planning conversation. There's lots to talk through from an emotional family point of view. And, rather than put the absolute down to what's better from a financial point of view, which is also hard to know. It's not an easy answer there that's going to be 100% right. It's also talking through what's going to make him and his partner and his kids happy and where their family are and schools, etc. My gut is, my initial thing, I wouldn't be worried too much around the equity out to buy the shares. That's fine to have that on P&I. It's just, particularly if you're just paying it off with equity, you can just keep the debt as is. So that's not the end of the world. The major thing is ultimately they're in a house they don't want to live in long term. It's also underperforming, but they've also, the good news is they've built say $800 to $1 million of equity in an investment property. I'm not sure what their home's worth, just quickly looking through here, or what their debt is on it. My gut would be to go all in on the A-grade suburb and try to get, if that's going to make them happy from a lifestyle point of view, with family and schools and everything like that, and try to buy the best property they can to get into that suburb. And if that means selling the investment property and then taking the $700,000-800,000 of gains after capital gains tax, taking the profits from the equity from their current place, and then getting a home that is really a forever home. You don't have to get an A-grade property in an A-grade suburb. Just try to get something that isn't majorly compromised, not a busy road, not really bad, aspects, not really any issues with privacy. So a decent property in this suburb rather than something that really is compromised. And then just, and maybe it's unrenovated, because ultimately the renovated places in those suburbs will be out of your budget, and then just renovate it over time in the future. And potentially, they're saying here rent, which I think is a good idea. If you're going to go and consider somewhere like Beecroft and you haven't lived there or family, etc. there, then maybe, you keep your properties in the market till you're absolutely sure. I've just seen here as well on the other side is you did have the home was worth sort of circa 3 with, equity of $1 million or something. So I don't know, you could probably almost have a reasonably low income on your a debt on your home. You'd still have a fair whack. And then once you've got on top of that and you've considered a renovation, then you can consider doing further investing, whether it's an investment property, whether it's shares, etc. And, in this marketplace, I would say, depending on the suburb you're entering and at the price point within it, you might find, I don't know, since I talked to you about this, Veronica, is that, in suburbs, you've got a glut of buyers at certain price points, and then at maybe, 10-15% above that, you're getting a real shortage of buyers. Yeah, there's a shortage of properties, but you have got some motivated vendors that need to sell, and a lot of buyers just haven't got the budget to get there, because ultimately they're borrowing everything they can from the bank, and they can only borrow so much from the family. And the family's saying, well, I'll bridge that gap to buy a good property, but I'm not going to give you an extra $500,000 to enter into the top of the market. And usually they would borrow that money from the bank and they would leverage themselves up, but they can't. And so you're naturally going to see at the moment, you see these buyers, a glut of buyers all at the middle to lower end of the market. And then at the higher end, I do think there's good buying. And so in this situation, if you could potentially transition out of, one average asset, you're saying that, not me, and, a good investment property that you can get a good price for at the moment, because there is good competition and it has performed quite well. As you said, you're getting some off-market offers. I would try to just go and get a really good asset in this situation. Get on top of the debt, and then as you start to, depending on your confidence with your income, just start to look at other investing down the line. Hopefully that was helpful.
A couple of things I'd add in there. For starters, I'm interested to where they really want to live.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because, and also whether the house that they're in, other than school zone, why don't you want to stay there? Do you not like the area? I mean, the house isn't quite, the aesthetically what people like in that area. But other than that, what is it about that home or that location that you don't want to be in? If you were just purely basing your location where you want to live on school zones, I would caution you not to do that. If that's the only reason you want to live in an area, because really and truly there are pros and cons of deciding where to live based on schooling. And personally, I just think that there are good schools everywhere, particularly if you're going to go private, for example. It doesn't really matter where you live. So it's also interesting that it considers Beecroft a B-grade suburb. I'm not sure the people that live in Beecroft would agree. There's some beautiful homes in Beecroft. So it might be that in their minds it's B-grade because it's really for them, that's a compromise. So I'd encourage you to go through an exercise. We do it with our clients, which is, we call it a getting started session, but it's an exercise of going through what your options are at different price points in different locations with different types of property so that you can really get clarity around really where you want to be. Now, if forgetting school for a minute, if you're just thinking that this is not a good principal place of residence because it's an underperformer in terms of capital growth, if you bought something that's very dated and out of character for the area, but it has other good characteristics. Now, I have the address of this, so I have looked at it online. Like, it's actually it's on a good street. It's actually got a good aspect. It's decent land size. It's a level block. It's got parking. There's actually quite a lot going for this house, except for the fact it's ugly as a hatful, right? So the opportunity there is to renovate and solve that glaring negative in that area. Yes, it'll never be a period home, but modern homes that are nicely designed and nicely finished in that area, they do very, very well. And it would be quite a substantial home in that area. So, there's more than one way to look at the asset, and there's more than one way to consider why is it underperforming. And that is because you've got unrealised opportunity in that particular property, for example. So there's lots of different ways to look at this sort of problem. The other thing that he's asked about really is, should they sell their investment property and reduce their debt exposure? Now, you touched on that. And the thing that I would say too, he's mentioned that he's got agents approaching him with these off-market offers, these buyers at off-market prices. Now, this is something to be very aware of. The agents at the moment are dealing in a low listings environment, right? Listings have been significantly down for some time. So agents aren't making as much money as they used to make, because the other thing is, when listings are low, there's a squeeze on commissions as well, because competition for each listing is higher, right? So they're using a lot of tactics to try to get people to part with their property. And one of them is approaching owners to see if they could dangle this off-market buyer carrot. And if you take the bait, then they'll just bring, a handful of people through without an agency agreement. This is actually not legal, by the way, but it happens all the time. Without an agency agreement, without a contract of sale, then they'll say, look, it didn't actually quite suit those buyers. However, I do have a lot of other buyers on the database. And you know what? The feedback was great. Even though it wasn't right for them, we should have organised a time. Would you like to sign up for a 2-week agency agreement, and we'll get those buyers through, and let's see how we go. They get those buyers through, and then they might get an offer that's not quite enough. We've had such great response to this. You know what? I think if we did an auction campaign, really took it to market, really ramped up the competition, I think you'll get a better outcome. This is how people actually get sucked into selling their homes when they weren't even really thinking about selling their homes. So you've got an investment property there, you've got agents approaching you. Part of the reason they're approaching you is because that's one way that they're using to prospect now. And so if you've taken the bite, then, they're going to keep on trying to reel you in, right? So I'd be very aware of that. And I think if you're deciding to sell an investment property, you have to have a strategy. I mean, talking to someone recently, only this week, about the same thing. She's on the hook, right? Agents actually giving her offers. And she's like, well, I don't even know if it's a good offer or a bad offer. And I said, well, what is your plan? Like, what are you planning to do with that money? And she doesn't know where she wants to live ultimately, all this similar sort of things, really. So you might get that money, you might pocket it. But if you don't have a plan of what to do and where you're going and why you're going to sell out, I would caution people to just take a moment and sit back and say, look, do I need to get out of the market right this minute, or should I work out what I want to do and where I want to be first? Now, I do have a little masterclass that I sell for $39. I'll put the link in the show notes. You can watch that. You can go through the process to work out these are the things that I should be thinking about before I decide to sell an investment property. Because once it's sold, you're out of the market, right? You've paid tax on that gain that you're currently getting the benefit of because you're not paying tax on it. So any capital gain sitting there earning, it's appreciating whilst prices are rising, and you're not paying tax on that at the moment, right? But when you do sell it, you're going to pay tax on it. So you've got less money to reinvest. And so I think it's really important to make sure that you've got a good plan before you do these things. That's probably, and the other thing too is I was talking about just, the various fees. For example, if he sells, yes, there's capital gains tax and there's all these other things involved. If you move from your principal place of residence and rent somewhere else, right? You might get a 6-year capital gains tax exemption until you buy another principal place of residence on your family home. But just a caution, land tax applies, right? You can get stung with a land tax bill by doing that. So that was just my 2 cents worth to add in there. Anything you'd want to sort of add in?
Yeah, I did forget something when I was trying to strategically do this in my mind, and just completely forgot how tight borrowing capacity is, right? And, you know, when we look at the numbers, and I'm looking at some more numbers here, I don't think you can borrow anywhere near the amount of debt that you've got right now. And so basically you've got to be, you know, if you go and try to re-leverage back into the market, right, and transact, you're going to have to, your net exposure to the market is going to be a lot less. And so you've got to make a choice whether less exposure is worth it in this market. And you might still make that decision if you're really under a bit of financial stress in terms of affording the mortgages, right, which I don't think it sounds like you are. You know, you go working part-time and you could be working full-time, so you're not like really needing the money, I guess. And so I would just say that's a real thing to note, because, you know, you can go from, say, 6 million market exposure and you might only be able to enter at 4 mil. And so, yeah, okay, we're in a better property, but in 3 or 4 years' time, do you regret it and going, well, if I hold on, both those properties would be worth 3.5 and my 4 is only worth 4.8. And, you know, maybe I'd be better off to hold it in this market. And so that would be my worry here as well, is that I think I agree with you when I look at these properties and addresses. While now isn't a great time to build, is there value in, you know, either a renovation DA to your current place or even a knockdown DA? And getting that through in that council might not be the easiest thing, but once you've got it through, particularly if it's done really well, it's really valuable, right? So, you know, are you best just to explore that regardless of whether you're going to build it or not? There's value in getting that DA. Do it well. Do it something that's going to be really tasteful, if you can. And maybe if you decided to sell it, you can sell it with some DA plans attached. That would be my other idea here. So, but yeah, you do need to be careful selling down in this market if you want to then re-enter, because you go, oh, actually, what am I actually? I'm not getting further ahead here. I'm actually getting further behind. And so don't rush to sell right now. You sometimes best just to, I'd love better assets, but I can't get better assets because I have to sell my poor asset right now in not the best market. And if I do want to re-enter, I can't buy anywhere near the market exposure as I've got now.
Yeah, and look, I do think owning a C-grade asset, if it's a C-grade asset and you can't buy back in, sometimes you're better off just getting rid of the C-grade assets, you know, and investing in something other than property. But the thing is too, with this particular investment property, it's another freestanding house on a decent block of land, right? Yeah. And, you know, I've looked at this as well, and the reality is I'm looking at that, is it highest and best use as it currently is? I don't think it is. It could be maximised. So was it bought, was it purchased with an intention to develop? Because it looks to me like an underdeveloped property. I'm not saying you could, you know, convert it into townhouses or anything. I'm thinking more the fact that it in itself looks like it will benefit from a makeover at the very least, but probably an extension, right? And it's very low yield currently. You know, you look at the raw numbers there, like Sydney property prices in the inner west, you know, they're high and the rents aren't particularly high as a ratio to those purchase price, but this is particularly low yielding property. And so, and that's usually what happens when it's underdeveloped, you know, because the actual, you know, you've bought land, effectively you're paying for this big block of land or piece of land in a prime area, but the house itself doesn't, you know, no one's paying for the land when they're paying rent. So these are things to be considering. Why did you buy that asset? Did you buy it with that intention? And if you did, then you know, like, is it worthwhile holding on for the long term and actually doing that and realising those gains if that was part of your original plan? So back again, this is about having a plan in the first place rather than just buying stuff because you can. And I think too that, you know, when you bought these two properties, December 19, just before COVID, right? And prices had just started moving again then. You know, we'd had 2 year slump, but was starting to look like a pretty busy market. Yeah. And then, of course, COVID hit, and then you bought the next one in a year later, or almost a year later, when interest rates were really low and borrowing capacity was much higher than it is now. And I think that goes to what Chris was saying about look at your borrowing capacity as a resource and consider that as well. All right.
Final point on that is that this property, no one can see this property, right? Which is great for the person asking the question. We haven't revealed the location of the property, but it is a brick build that's also attached to another brick build, right? And so the issue of renovating this is it's going to look weird a little bit if you've got this when it's attached to the neighbours, and maybe you're restricted in terms of renovating it. But who owns that neighbour's property? What are their plans? Like, and if you joined your two blocks together, now you've got 400 of north-facing, or slightly northeast, but pretty north-facing rear backyard in a premium part of the inner west on a good street. That would be an architect's dream, right? And you could do something pretty special if you joined them together or did a duplex together or something. So I'd be knocking on your neighbour's door and find out what their plans are as well, because potentially doing something together could be, something that's, much better than you renovating or doing a knockdown yourself if you do something together. And I've seen people do that together with semis, and it always looks so much better when you've they match it together rather than you've got up and then yours looks weird next to theirs, and all your boundaries at the back are a bit funny, like yours is a bit further forward. It's just doesn't look as slick as you're doing it together. So
I know the neighbours, so reach out, Andy, if you want to have a chat. All right. Lastly, we have a listener, Dumbo, to share. This is from Becky. I just think this is gold, and I really appreciate you sending through your Dumbo, Becky. And we appreciate all the questions and the fact check as well. Please, can I tell you my Dumbo? My father-in-law had intended to transfer a property he inherited to his son to avoid yearly land tax. Land tax seems to be the theme of this episode, only he didn't consider the year it was purchased, which was 1989. He signed all the documents, and at the last minute, the solicitor advised him he would be up for about $240,000 in capital gains tax. He pulled the plug, as that's way too high. He spent the next 12 months doing all he could to reduce or offset his income to lower the overall tax bill. The latest property valuation has risen $300,000. So his capital gains tax is now more likely to be around $315,000. I have no utter words for his utter stupidity. And I think this just goes to people thinking they can control things that they can't control. It's quite funny.
Look, I do think this is when people have got a little bit of knowledge, they're dangerous. And I think when people are worrying about things like land tax and they're forgetting that the value is actually the growth in properties. And ultimately, you don't want to give money to the government. There's that obsession, right, sometimes with past generations. And if you wanted, for example, to give this property to your son to avoid some land tax, well, maybe that's not the end of the world. If the property's gone up $300,000, why don't you just sell this property, right? Pay the CGT, give the money to the kids, and then they can go on and do what's right for them. Often we see in this situation when someone's trying to attach, they're giving the assets to them, right? Okay, well then it should be their choice what to do with it. They put all these obligations and, you can't sell it because I gave it to you. And then people are sort of stuck in this, prison of this house that the family gave them, but it's not really matched to what their needs are. And so, look, in my view here is that the parent should be actually okay. Well, my property's got up, right, and I've got up another $300,000. Well, that covers my CGT. So I can sell the property. I can give exactly what I thought I was going to give to the kids last year, pay the CGT, and then let them live the life that they want to live and make the property decisions that they want to make. So I'm sorry, Becky, if I've ranted on, but that would be, but I know the challenges you're probably dealing with here. You're probably dealing with someone who's got a lot of sentimental value to it. They're anti-taxes. They've probably, maybe ran a cash business over the years as well. I'm just generalizing here. And they wouldn't do anything they can not to give money to the government, but by not doing that, they've actually saved themselves. By not selling, they've actually got an extra $300,000 of growth, and that would actually still help their family out, if they just gave them cash, not property. All
right. Thank you all for sending those questions in, and maybe do another one of these in 6 months or so.
Let's do it.
If you have a question that you'd like us to answer in an upcoming Q&A episode, you can send us a voicemail or written question via the website, theelephantintheroom.com.au, or you can email us directly at questions@theelephantintheroom.com.au. If you like what you're hearing, please share this episode with others you feel would benefit. And while you're at it, why not leave us an iTunes review? 5 stars would be great. I know that sounds a bit cringy, but we have it on good authority that every review helps make it easier for other people to find out about us and hear what our amazing guests have to say.